Hello and welcome back to All About Russia. My name is Andrew and today we're going to be looking at a small ethnic group located in one of the most extreme points of the Russian Federation, the Chukchi. The Chukchi, or Ligorovatolets in their native tongue, are an indigenous community who primarily reside in their autonomous okrug of Chukotka. As of the 2010 census, there were just under 16,000 Chukchi in the Russian Federation, with most living in Chukotka, although they only make up the majority in the Chukotsky district. Outside of Chukotka, a significant community can also be found in the neighbouring Kamchatka Krai, with a small scattering of Chukchi across the Sakha Republic, the Magadan Oblast, and distant Moscow. Their indigenous name, Ligorovatolets, means real people, and this comes from the idea that they are human beings, not spirits or demons. Their exonym Chukchi actually comes from a Chukchi word, Chauchu, meaning rich in reindeer. Interestingly, traditionally, not all Chukchi dealt with reindeer, and within the Chukchi community, there was a historical division: the Chauchu, or reindeer Chukchi, and the Enkwalit, or maritime Chukchi. Being so few in number, the Chukchi have no sub-ethos groups. However, historically, they did have a clan system. This system has, however, largely fallen out of fashion, and for reasons I will explain later in this video, official records are hard to find about how many tribes still technically exist. The Chukchi language is in the Chukotka branch of the Kamchatkan-Chukotkan family tree, and today is not widely spoken, with only around 5,000 native speakers, mostly over the age of 30. The Chukchi language is unrelated to any neighbouring language, although some anthropologists and linguists have tried to make a connection to several Native American languages. As such, the Chukchi language has some unusual anomalies not always found in many languages. Firstly, like French, it uses a 2-decimal counting system, so the number 6 does not exist in Chukchi. It would be 5 and 1. Secondly, it was a cultural taboo historically in Chukchi society for women to use certain sounds that existed in their language, often replacing them with another. Thus, when saying the name of the spirit demon Retin, a female Chukchi might say Tetin instead. Dialects do exist in the Chukchi language, but all are comprehensible to other Chukchi speakers, differing only in their exposure to the Koryak and Itelmen language respectively. All Chukchi speak Russian, and this language is far more prevalent amongst the younger generation. Traditionally, Chukchi had no script, and today uses an augmented Cyrillic one. This began in 1821, when missionaries first started printing religious material phonetically for the Chukchi using the Russian script. This would continue for most of the century, ignorant to the fact that the Chukchi were largely illiterate at the time. It wasn't until 1932 that a specific script was created for the Chukchi, based on a Latin script, only to be changed to a Cyrillic one in 1937, in line with Soviet policy towards national minority languages. This was augmented in the 40s, 50s and 1980s to reflect sounds not quite captured by the Cyrillic alphabet. Curiously, the first native script for the Chukchi was developed in 1927, almost by accident. A Chukchi reindeer herder created a simple pictorial script to communicate with his son via long distance. However, as this was used exclusively within this one family, it was not widely adopted. Archaeologists trace the first human settlement in Chukotka back to around 18,000 BC, but can only date the Chukchi as having lived there since around 4000 BC. Traditionally, the Bering Land Bridge allowed travel between Northeast Asia and Northwest America, but its collapse around 10,000 BC possibly provided the genesis of the Chukchi as we know them today, who are often considered the genetic first cousins of Native American tribes. As we mentioned in our video on the Chukotka Autonomous Okrug, much of early Chukchi history is unknown, and we are forced to rely on tales and legends to fill in those gaps. The Chukchi, as a reflection of their severe landscape, were traditionally a very aggressive and warlike people, whose society preyed on others for slaves and resources just to survive. Their own legends state driving out the mythical Shelag and Onkelon people and roaming east and west of the Colima River armed with stone and bone weaponry. The Chukchi utilised both dogs and reindeer to pull their sleighs across the tundra in their hunts and raids, and in the mythos of many northern people, the Yukagir, the Saka and the Itaman to name a few, they are recorded as a menace. Early Chukchi society itself was tribal, with a clear clan system in place that descended patrilineally and were the undisputed masters of the Arctic, lords of all they surveyed. This pattern of life, living off of their reindeer herds, living off the bounty of the sea, and raiding nearby peoples when necessary, would continue unabated for centuries. Metallurgy, navigation, empire, these were all ideas from the south that completely passed the Chukchi by, isolated in their tundra. Thus, in 1642, when the Chukchi first encountered the Russians, it left a profound impact on their entire society. This first contact was of course hostile, and fierce skirmishes with the westernmost Chukchi tribes prompted Russian interest to wane. The Chukchi were organised, aggressive, and their lands held few furs. Thus the Cossacks turned their attention elsewhere. Establishing an ostrog in 1660 on the site of present-day Anadyr, it was a tenuous position supposed to act as a base of operations for future Russian expansion. What it became was a target, with regular Chukchi raids against the wooden structure, forcing the few Cossacks therein to bunker down and wait for resupplies. In the year 1700, the Chukchi stepped up their raiding, launching devastating attacks on the northern Yukagir villages. This in itself was not unusual, as the Chukchi had been the bogeymen of the Yukagir for some centuries. These raids were for plunder, slaves and women, and bear a striking similarity to the raids of the Apaches and Comanches in North America. However, what was different was that the Yukagir had accepted Russian overlordship, and a perk of this was Russian protection. The next year, a Russian force ventured north into Chukchi lands. Using steel weapons and firearms, the Russians destroyed yurts, captured women and children, and retreated back to Anadyr. The Chukchi clan system at this point was alive and well, and this punitive Russian action prompted a Chukchi response, with several hundred Chukchi rallying to besiege the beleaguered Anadyrsk Ostrog. Over the years, the limited interactions between the Russians and the Chukchi grew, and covetous eyes began to turn to the unknown wealth of the Chukchi lands. In 1727, Afanasy Shestakov, a Russian Cossack leader, led a force of troops supported by Yakut and Yukagir auxiliaries in an attempt to bring Chukotka to heel. For over 20 years they campaigned in Chukotka, killing anyone who stood against them and burning many villages to the ground. Many innocents were slaughtered, and many women captured into sexual bondage with the Cossacks. This dedicated campaign was a huge cultural shock to the Chukchi. The Chukchi themselves often raided their neighbours, but such an invasion on such a scale was a massive cultural shock to the Chukchi. Never before had they been attacked on such a scale. The impact of this cannot be underestimated. It was so profound that not only did it lead to a long distrust of the Cossacks in Russian service, but it also changed Chukchi mythology, with mentions of pale-faced demons arriving from the sea. Afanasy's campaign was ended in 1747, when he and his men were ambushed by a huge multi-clan Chukchi force that massacred them all and stole Anadyr's entire 4,000 head of reindeer. It is worth at this point clarifying how the Chukchi were so effective at fighting the Russians even though they were armed with primitive weaponry. The Chukchi were masters of their terrain and utilised it to amazing effect. By utilising hit and run tactics led by reindeer and dog sleighs, they ambushed the Russians throughout their campaign, leaving them without supplies and exposed to the elements. The fruitless and wasteful campaign against the Chukchi actually led to a change in imperial policy. In distant St. Petersburg, Tsarina Elizabeth decided on a policy of reconciliation. In 1763, Friedrich Plenisser, a German in Russian employment, was sent to Chukotka to ascertain whether it was worth staying. Quickly coming to the conclusion that it was futile, in 1771 the Russians abandoned Anadyrsk, leaving Chukotka. This also meant leaving the Koryaks, Lukagir and others to the mercy of the Chukchi tribes. Yet the Chukchi did not immediately descend on the peoples. Having had contact with Europeans for over a century now, Eurasian diseases that had not survived the far north before began to be encountered more regularly by the Chukchi. In an echo of the story of their genetic cousins, the Amerindians, disease ravaged the Chukchi, with smallpox and syphilis wreaking havoc among Chukchi society. Whilst the Russians had left Chukotka, others did not, and soon British and French explorers landed off the coast of Chukotka throughout the mid-1770s. This sent a wave of fear throughout the Russian government. Catherine the Great, having learned the lessons of waging war against the Chukchi, advocated peace and citizenship, and so sent ambassadors back to Chukchi lands. Arriving in March of 1778, the first Chukchi chief, Omelat Kurgintov, was convinced to accept Russian rule, and so ended the epoch of the Free Chukchi. Although not quite, for you see, this overlordship was incredibly conditional. Firstly, the Russians had no intentions on settling properly in Chukotka as they had in other parts of the east. This was more a case of raising the Russian flag, a triviality to the Chukchi, who cared more for reindeer than fabric. The hated Yasak was exempted for a nominal 10-year period, although this may well have been abolished, as the Chukchi very rarely ever paid this. Lastly, so long as they did not raid the Koryaks to the south, who had also accepted Russian overlordship, the Chukchi were left to their own affairs, free of Russian influence. So why? Why, after years of fighting the Russians, did the Chukchi accept even nominal overlordship? As previously mentioned, the Chukchi had been diminished by disease and war, and were not, at this point, the same towering military Arctic power they had been before. Furthermore, peace with the Russians brought trade, and in 1788 the first annual Chukchi fair was held, trading furs, walrus, ivory and glass beads for precious metal, food and tools. The introduction of metal, as it did everywhere on the planet, revolutionised Chukchi society. Metal weapons and tools were longer lasting, harder and more reliable. This made Chukchi hunting far more effective, allowing them to use their time more effectively. All of these factors, combined with only a nominal Russian presence, made this overlordship extremely transactional. The Russians secured their northeastern border, and the Chukchi improved their quality of life. In 1815, the first Orthodox missionaries entered Chukotka, establishing 4 Orthodox schools for native Chukchi children. This mission was based around Anadyr, the sole Russian presence in Chukotka, and was aimed at bringing a generation of Chukchi into the Orthodox sphere. Matters were, however, complicated between the Russians and the Chukchi due to vast cultural differences. The Chukchi, like many Arctic people, practiced polygamy. Elders in Chukchi society were not taken care of and often left out to die in the wilderness. Gender roles were often reversed and mixed in Chukchi society, practicing concepts such as two-spiriting. Furthermore, the core Chukchi belief system centered around appeasing regional spirits and deities. What confounded the Russian authorities too was the lack of centralization. Despite their efforts, there was no Chukchi king or high chief. Each tribe, each family unit had their own relation with the confounded Russian state. This made development painfully slow, and it took many years for relations to improve. Nevertheless, improve they did, and this was so much so that in 1848, the annual fair was moved to Anhui, deep within Chukchi territory. This granted the Russians greater access to Chukchi goods, as well as actually easier trading, as they could sail up via the Bering Strait. Notably, the outside world had begun to seep into Chukchi society at this point. A Chukchi living in 1600 would have had bone tools, wore sealskin clothing, and often eaten raw meat, whereas his descendant in 1800 would have had steel weaponry, wore European cloth and fabric, and eaten a variety of vegetables, spices, and even smoked tobacco. This access to the wider world brought troubles too, and in 1884, after contact with American whaler ships, an outbreak of smallpox killed around a third of the Chukchi population. By the turn of the century, only around 12 tribes remained, still numbering several thousand Chukchi. Trade with Russian, as well as American and Canadian prospectors, led to metal and goods being prevalent among the Chukchi, who still reigned across the tundra and the coast. Whilst there had been gradual Russian immigration into the region, these were centred almost exclusively around Anadyr, and the Chukchi were still the majority in the region. Despite the influx of new ideas, the Chukchi lived their lives as they always had, living off of their reindeers and the sea's bounty. Being so far removed from the rest of the world, the First World War, the Russian Revolution, and the Civil War that followed all passed Chukotka by. Yet the supremacy of the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War would have a profound impact on Chukchi society, and some might say the death knell. In 1924, Soviet authorities, as part of a wider approach to the northern peoples of the Soviet Union, made plans to Sovietize Chukchi society. In 1926, only 72 Chukchi were literate, a legacy of the Orthodox missionaries, and thus huge efforts were made to make the Chukchi literate. Schools were set up in Chukotka to teach reading and writing to the Chukchi, both in their native language and in Russian. Infrastructure was improved, and clinics set up to better treat the periodic outbreaks of disease that ravaged Chukchi communities. The Chukchi were elevated to positions of authority in this new system, and women too were enfranchised to speak and lead themselves. The herds of reindeer were collectivized, and collective fisheries formed. Chukchi trappers and hunters were employed by the state to catch runaway Gulag prisoners along the Kolyma River. Yet not every impact on Chukchi society was positive. These, along with other changes, were not necessarily accepted by everyone. And by 1934, only a third of the reindeer herds had been successfully collectivized. Low-level banditry and disobedience was rife across the tundra, with Red forces punishing those found mutilating or killing their own herd to avoid losing them to the collectivization effort. Aspects of Chukchi society that had long been at odds with Russian society were actively persecuted too. Polyamory was discouraged, two-spiriting and native beliefs outlawed, whilst the family structure of the Chukchi was shattered, reorganized into a nuclear Soviet model. By the time of the Second World War, the Chukchi was still the majority in their lands, but their society had transformed into something unrecognizable. The banditry and disobedience had been quashed, and greater efforts to collectivize the huge reindeer herds was made to support the war effort. Desperate for volunteers, some Chukchi actually enlisted in the Red Army. Numbers are hard to get on exactly how many went, but it's estimated anywhere up to 1,000 Chukchi may have enlisted. Life for the Chukchi 30 years after the Bolshevik victory was quite different than before. By 1959, they were the minority in their own lands. Collectivized herds, Russified lifestyles, and access to literature, healthcare, and support from the state had transformed the formerly self-sufficient Chukchi into just another of the Soviet people, reliant on the state for support. Under the Soviet system, their numbers had grown, but with a huge dependence on the state. When that state collapsed in the early 90s, this sent shockwaves throughout Chukchi society. The herds were split up and bought out by regional bigwigs. The schools and clinics closed as funding stopped and an exodus of skilled workers left. This led to the demographics shifting more in favour of the Chukchi, but their support from the government had gone. The old and young died without it, and a generation of Chukchi lost themselves to drink and despair. When Roman Abramovich came to power as the governor of Chukotka in 2000, aid for the Chukchi began to appear in earnest. Schools reopened, clinics were restored, and the villages were once again connected to Anadir, with supplies of food, medicine and money arriving more regularly. Yet even with this huge help from the state, Chukchi society is still struggling. Tuberculosis and alcoholism still ravage the villages of Chukotka, where child mortality, especially in rural areas, are extremely high at over 15%. The declining birth rate of the Chukchi themselves, in addition to this, puts their society in a precarious position, one that hopefully will improve with time. Most Chukchi today are either adherents of the Russian Orthodox Church or are irreligious, both the legacy of colonialism. A small minority still practice indigenous shamanic beliefs, which are heavily interwoven with native mythology. In this belief system, it holds that there are three worlds: a higher, lower and middle world, with many planes of existence in each realm. Chukchi belief holds that many deities and spirits inhabit these planes of existence, often taking animal form to interact with humans. Interestingly, there are several similarities with other Arctic peoples with regard to mythology, such as the Inuit. Within Chukchi lore, some of the most powerful spirits to appease are Koravagirgin, the protector of the herd, Karetkun, the protector of sea animals, and Korikal, a trickster spirit who often takes the form of a raven. As mentioned earlier, with the decline of their native beliefs, so too diminished the indigenous culture. The Chukchi today are largely monogamous, and few, if any, practice two-spiriting, a concept we discussed in the Aleut video. This extends to tattoos, traditionally an important part of Chukchi culture, as is the case with many Arctic peoples. Both men and women would be heavily tattooed, and were both used to ward off evil spirits, as well as inform strangers of their clan loyalties. Nowadays, tattoos are rarer amongst the Chukchi. Traditional clothing amongst the Chukchi consists of similar sets of clothing for both men and women. Due to the extreme weather, men traditionally wore trousers and an overshirt made from fur and leather, with thick leather boots and a hoodie of sorts made from insulating layers of reindeer fur. Women tended to wear an overall of sorts, trimmed with fur and covered with a hoodie as well. Jewellery such as sea glass, beads and later metals also adorn traditional female clothing. Nowadays, such clothing is primarily reserved for festivals and celebrations, and the Chukchi wear modern clothing. An interesting cultural note is the Chukchi, whether by cause of their appearance, have long been the butt of many Russian jokes, often poking fun at their perceived primitiveness or simplicity. This is common even today, with a child who is wearing many layers possibly chided by their parents as looking like a Chukcha. Despite abandoning their native belief system, many of the ceremonies and traditions are still held in Chukchi society, relating to the cycle of life. The first slaughtering of the deer in August, the separating of the herds in spring, and the calving season are all celebrated with performances and feasting, often accompanied with tambourines and singing. Chukchi cuisine is very much an acquired taste, competing with Icelandic and Scottish cuisine in the most difficult to appreciate. Meat and fat play large roles in Chukchi cooking, with reindeer meat, fish, whale meat and seal meat all common ingredients. Reindeer blood is often used as a substitute for olive oil or butter, both being hard to get so far north. Perhaps the most unusual dish is moniello, moss that has been digested in a deer's stomach, often stewed with reindeer blood and offal. The Chukchi are a tiny population, hidden away in one of the most extreme parts of the Russian Federation. Despite their evident hardships, the population is growing, though it remains to be seen whether a cultural renaissance can be achieved here. Thank you for watching. My name is Andrew. Up next are the Chulins. Paka!